Welcome to another edition of the show. My name is Andrew Wilcox. Thanks for tuning in. Glad to be back doing more shows. Really excited about this. I'm super excited about today's show. This is a topic that I heard about a couple of years ago and really hasn't left my mind. I find it incredibly interesting, and I'm sort of slowly moving towards one side instead of the other. At first, I thought it was a bit of a crazy idea. It was something I was really nervous about trying without even really knowing why. And that's why I wanted to talk to somebody about it, especially cell-based meat. Yes, meat grown from the cell. We'll explain it a little bit more in the podcast. I don't know. I still get like heebie-jeebies or whatever it would be called about eating meat that was basically just grown in a vat out of cells. But I'd try it. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't think. Well, that's really the question. So today we're talking to Mary Allen. She comes from the Good Food Institute, and we're going to talk to her a little bit about what they call plant-based meat and cell-based meat. And I think in the end, if it means that we get to go back to more family-based farms instead of large factory farms, I think this could be a good thing if we find a balance between plant-based, cell-based, and, well, meat. Anyway, give it a listen. Think for yourself. See what you think. Would you give it a try? Would you eat cell-based meat? Here's Mary Allen on another edition of Wander with Andrew Wilcox.
Welcome to Wander with Andrew Wilcox.
Can you tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited. So as you mentioned, I am the content specialist for the Good Food Institute, and I am a Tennessee native, Brooklyn transplant now, who sort of wandered sideways into this space. I was working in publishing, actually, for Penguin Random House, and I was doing a lot of work with some of the vegetarian and vegan cookbooks, and I was also really into running, and it sort of piqued my interest, this idea of sort of following a plant-based diet as a way to level up my running practice, and I really wanted to qualify for the Boston Marathon, so I decided to sort of try plant-based eating on for size, and had sort of a phenomenal personal journey, as I'm sure lots of people have stories like that about sort of their relationship with food. But it totally changed my identity around food in the sense that I used to have such a firm grounding in what I did like to eat, what I didn't like to eat. And then just sort of after experimenting a little bit for a month, my taste totally changed. And it sort of sent me down this path of exploring the food system from sort of more of a systems perspective rather than a personal choice perspective. And I got just really interested in writing about the food system, and began to understand more sort of the environmental and societal impacts of the choices we make with every meal. And that is how GFI came onto my radar. And I thought that what GFI was doing, so now I'll tell you a little bit about the Good Food Institute. I just thought it was so smart and so different. So the Good Food Institute is a nonprofit think tank that is accelerating the plant-based and the cell-based meat industries as a way to just make the default choice for everyone a better choice without having people have to change their minds or change their identities or change their food choices in a radical way. Let's just make food choices that are better for the planet, better for public health, and that are equally or more delicious. Let's just make them widely available and very accessible and affordable for everyone, and approachable, frankly. And I was just captivated by that notion because there are so many organizations out there that are working hard to convince people to make different choices, to change their consumer patterns, and are doing that on sort of like a one-to-one, consumer-to-consumer level. And I think that work can be empowering for individual consumers. I certainly had that sort of experience when I realized that I did have choices where before I'd just been sort of following along without spending a whole lot of time or energy thinking about it. But frankly, everyone's got a limited supply of time and energy, and some people care deeply about the food system. Some people don't, and not everyone can. There's so many challenges to sort of countenance in our interactions with the world on a daily basis. So the idea of changing it at the supply level and changing it at the institutional level, rather than asking every single consumer to make a different choice all of the time, just felt really pragmatic and necessary, because as I think we're all starting to realize, we're really running out of runway, especially on the climate change side. So anyway, that is what brought me to the Good Food Institute.
Let me. Would you agree with this? I think that there was a period of time where there was a lot of growth in the food. What used to be a family farm based thing became an industry. And that industry grew really, really quickly in a time where we weren't really aware of what it was doing. And then it got to a point where it was so large and we all became aware of what it was doing, both to the environment and to the animals. And then we're left in this sort of spot where we have an argument between what has become the normal North American diet and what we know we have ethical issues with. And we don't have the time to pay attention to it. That to me is what seems to have happened, because I kind of come from the other end of the food eating, because I grew up on a family farm. I grew up on a family farm where I watched the animals get treated very, very well. I watched the entire process from absolute start to absolute finish. And I've never had an ethical qualm with how it was done in that way. But then I see the way that mass production is done and all of that, and how most of our meat gets to our table these days. And I'm not really okay with a lot of that. I think a lot of people aren't really okay with a lot of that. But as you said, we don't have the time to change an entire system that's all of a sudden come into existence. Individually, but I think as a group, we have to start looking at these solutions, and that's why I wanted to speak to you today, because I think that a couple of things that you guys are working on are really interesting solutions.
Absolutely, and I think that's exactly right. Is that our food system has just seen sort of a phenomenal amount of consolidation since the 1970s. And more, the way that our food is produced has become something that we don't interact with that closely on a daily basis for a variety of reasons. And it's true that most people aren't comfortable with what happens in sort of those conventional animal agriculture operations. And there's a reason that people are often offended when they're asked to look at those images. They don't want to, but they still buy it and they still eat it, and that is something that perhaps may change as awareness continues to shift, but certainly it hasn't really yet. So what GFI is doing is looking at sort of the success that we have seen in just really recent years with innovative plant-based companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, who began thinking about plant-based meats in a totally different way. It wasn't what are the sort of leftover ingredients that we already have on hand from like the industries that already exist. Let's cram them together into sort of a toothy plant-based product that we can feed to the vegetarians and market to the vegetarians. They went back and looked at what makes meat delicious and so craveable for so many meat eaters. What is it that people love about that? And can we just source that directly from plants? Because when you think about it, all meat starts as plants.
Yep.
Like all of our livestock, they eat plants and then they process them and then turn them into muscle, and then humans eat that muscle. What if we just cut the animal out of the equation and stopped using them as sort of this meat processing facility, which is what we're doing now, which is inherently very inefficient, because when you think about how many calories you eat versus how many calories you turn into more it's a lot more that you eat than that you turn into quote unquote meat. The same is true for animals. So if we can just cut the animal out of the equation, go straight to the plant, then we can create something that is way more efficient from a resource standpoint, that also eliminates sort of this cognitive dissonance that so many people feel about not being super comfortable with their way their meat is being created, but not really knowing what else to do, because how else are they going to eat meat? And they love the way it tastes, and it's not as important to them as it might be for some other people, this discomfort. So Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat started to create plant-based burgers that were really these high fidelity products, just by looking at it at a really granular level, from the very taste molecules that make it so craveable. And they started marketing it not to vegans and vegetarians, but to the flexitarians and to the people who do eat meat, but maybe not all the time, and maybe would like to eat a little bit less meat, but don't need to take on the identity of a vegan to do that. And that has started to just blow the market wide open. And so that is sort of the change that we're seeing in the plant-based sector. And it's created just a tremendous amount of momentum. Last year, the growth in the plant-based meat product category was 23%,
wow,
which is huge.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the plant-based meat side of what GFI is doing. And then, so we are working to accelerate this space. And what that looks like is we have a team of scientists, policy experts, corporate engagement specialists, and business analysts who are working to support the companies in this space with open access materials to make sure that no entrepreneurs have to sort of start from square one. And similarly, to bring the big players in this space, the big food companies, the big meat companies, and the suppliers and the distributors, to bring them into this space, because their infrastructure is going to be critically important to leveling this up to the level that it needs to get to.
One that we definitely had here, I don't know if you have this, I don't think you do, A&W restaurant. I think I saw that Carl's Jr. I think I saw that Carl's Jr. has done a similar thing in the States, but a Beyond Meat burger. And that came out like last year. And I remember having a lot of people come to me going like, you got to eat this burger. It tastes like a burger. Yeah. And it does. It's closer than any vegetarian burger that I've ever had before. So I think that those types of things are what's going to help to propel the plant-based patty burger forward. Definitely.
Absolutely. And to that point, you know, in terms of sort of efficiency and flavor, both, you know, conventional slaughtered meat is sort of as efficient as it could get in terms of production, and it tastes like what it is going to taste like. But for plant-based burgers, like they're only, the more that this innovation continues, they're only going to get tastier and tastier and more high fidelity, and even more efficient as they figure out how to produce them at greater and greater scale, and leverage the economies of scale that right now conventional animal agriculture is able to leverage. So that's the plant-based side of GFI's work. And then we are also working to accelerate what is the cell-based meat industry. And I would be clear that cell-based meat is not currently on the market, but when GFI was founded about 3 years ago and change, there was one cell-based meat company that had just incorporated, and now there are more than 24 around the world that we and more sort of in stealth mode.
Yeah, Memphis Meats was the one that brought me to this conversation.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because that's yeah, it's a kind of a crazy concept. Like, and I think it's going to take people a lot to wrap their head around it, but it's really interesting what it could come out. And as you said, it's gone from a very small number of companies to constantly growing. And from what I understand, the cost per piece has gone down quite dramatically in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. And it will continue to. Think about how much the first prototype of an iPhone costs versus now, like the relative cost now.
Yeah.
Still high, but
yeah.
certainly much lower in that particular example. But yeah, so cell-based meat is animal meat that has been created sort of without an animal. And how you do it is you take a sample of animal cells and you bathe them in the nutrients that they need to grow, and they will proliferate and divide, and you can ultimately grow the same muscle product that you eat every time you have a burger, or eventually, sort of a more complex tissue like a steak. And in fact, this year, or this 2018, I guess, an Israeli company called Aleph Farms debuted the first sort of cell-based steak, which was a huge milestone for the development of the industry. So it's similar if you think about it to when you propagate a plant, right? You take a cutting of that plant and then you plant it in new soil and you get a new plant. It is the same idea, but just with muscle cells. And what it allows you to do is grow just the meat that you need to grow without all of the other things that happen when you are raising an animal for the sole purpose of eating its meat. You're also, growing bones and feathers and all these things that you're not actually going to have real use for. So it allows you to just zero in on exactly what you need. And it also it eliminates the billions of animals that we raise and slaughter every year from that equation when you don't need to have an entire animal in order to just get the meat.
One of the interesting points I heard about this and why the word clean meat works so well for it in this sense is this also didn't have a life that included waste. It didn't, it wasn't an animal that had, waste and out in a field and rolling around and blood and bits and bone and everything else in it. So you might go, oh, that sounds disgusting, but like the real process kind of is disgusting in a lot of ways. And no medications, no all of that type of stuff. It is literally just a piece of muscle. And as I understand it, also they're working with fat as well in order to make sure that it has the marbling of a steak and all of that, so that we get the similar experience in that. So it really, for those that may be afraid, like what's going into this, you got to also think about what's going into your steak every time around.
Right, and I think that is I think that's a crucial point. I think you're right on. Is often what people don't necessarily see when they just buy a piece of meat in the grocery store is the fact that the vast majority of our antibiotics actually go into our animal ag system, not into human healthcare. And the reason is because on the one hand, antibiotics help the animals gain weight more rapidly so they can reach slaughter weight faster. And then on the other hand, the conditions that the animals are being raised in often just require antibiotics to stay alive long enough to be slaughtered. And so if you're concerned about the process, one of the lovely things about cell-based meat is that it will be so transparent. It will be something that consumers can see sort of from start to finish and will hopefully be interested in learning about, because it won't be sort of hidden from sight because it's so unsavory to countenance the reality of. And the other thing that it eliminates is, to your point, the possibility of fecal contamination, which is something that is sort of inherent in the current process. And so a lot of the sort of food poisoning that we see is even when our romaine lettuce,
Yeah.
even when lettuce is getting a bad rap, it's
Yeah.
typically because there was animal ag and sort of further up the water supply or something like that. So we eliminate all of that, and then the methane, of course, that is attributable to the farts and the poos that are unavoidable when you're raising that many animals.
Well, when you have such large scale animal production, absolutely. I think when you say transparency, I think transparency would be absolutely necessary for people, because that's I think the biggest thing that's going to be the toughest for people to get past. And I'm not going to lie, myself, I have a problem with it. I love meat. I had a burger before this. I'm going to have fried chicken later. I know that's going to happen. And for me, I just go, there's just a weirdness about it. I don't know what that is. I've looked at every reason to eat it. It all makes sense. Everything you just said makes sense. There's just a weirdness about it. And I think that whatever that feeling is might be one of the toughest challenges that this style of meat has. So I think transparency is going to be absolutely required so people can see every step of it.
Mm-hmm. And I think transparency is one of the really important points of differentiation. And the people who work in animal ag are just trying to feed people, right? And same with the cell-based meat companies, just trying to feed people. But I think the cell-based meat companies are extremely excited to explain to people how this works, because to your point, when the headline is something like lab grown meat, right? Like that's clickable because with the word lab, you're like, oh, like I don't know. But there are so many parallels where technology has been introduced, and people have first, sort of like raised an eyebrow. Think about in vitro fertilization, now IVF, which is positively mundane, right? Like IVF is not controversial anymore, but when it was first introduced, it was. And when it was first introduced, ice made in houses was also controversial because it wasn't being harvested from a lake and shipped around. Like every time there is a new technological advance, at first it's like a little bit new to people. And change is sometimes a little bit hard to wrap your head around. But I think it will have a lot to do with the way that people come to understand what it is. If you understand sort of the environmental and the public health benefits that are involved in sort of this new process of discovery, which is really harnessing sort of what is already happening with the way that cells grow and divide anyway. We're just taking that same biology and we're doing it outside of the animal. When that is framed in a way that where people understand the science, and they also understand all of the reasons that it could be so game-changing for our food system and for climate change, then people are really excited to try it. We actually did a poll in which we saw that 66% of consumers were willing to try cell-based meat when it was introduced to them in a way that helped them understand it. As opposed to just saying like test tube burger, like what's coming next. Certainly, right? That's not a message that's going to get anyone interested in trying it. And the point, it's not designed to do that particular message. When you see that framing, it's typically because the person framing it in that way has a different motive.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I was talking to some friends and some people about having this interview and about this concept, because it's so interesting to me. And I said, yeah, it's grown, cell-based grown meat. It's basically they grow the muscle. And one guy was like, so like a test tube baby. And I was like, no. Like that's so far from what it is. There's no nerves. There's no pain, right? There's none of that.
There's no pain.
It removes all of that part of it. There's no thought, no brain, no anything like that. It's literally grown muscle created for us to eat and sustain, which, and he was, oh, okay. And then after saying that, he was more into the idea of doing it. But that's the problem, is that you're going to get that instant reaction. If it's not explained, people go, oh, yeah, test tube meat. It's test tube babies. No. There's no, it's not going to all of a sudden grow an eyeball, or you're going to get.
Oh, no.
Well, you think about that. You get those chicken nuggets, and everybody's got the story of the chicken nuggets that's got like a cancer in it or something like that.
Right.
You're not going to get a grown piece of meat that's all of a sudden got an eyeball in the middle of it, and they went, "Oh, well, we messed up on that one." I don't think that's in the cards for this type of process.
0%.
Yeah. But that is a fear that people would have. I think a fear
And
that people
it's something,
would have.
to your point, it's something that should be, that thought is something that should be taken seriously, and then information should be provided, and that's why the transparency that all of these companies, I mean, just go to any of their company pages and look up the FAQs, because they're all excited to share what they're doing and share what this technology could mean for the planet, and for our food system. Because the truth is that meat consumption is rising globally, and not just because populations are increasing, it's rising per capita,
Really?
which means that despite all of these headlines that we see about like people going vegan and vegetarianism trending, veganism trending, meat consumption in North America had a banner year in 2018, and 2019 is projected to be a banner year for the United States. So we're going to have to figure out how to do something, and very soon, if we're going to figure out how to feed 10 billion people sustainably in 2050.
Oh, that's crazy to think about 10 billion people.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a world that we can see where not all meat production is gone, but all meat production is ethical, right? There can be some family farms that, we still have it. There can be this cell-based meat. There can be plant-based meat, and it all tastes good. And because in the end, that's what's going to win people over. It tastes good, and they know where their food's coming from, because now we're in a world where you can't snow anybody about anything anymore. The information is all available to us, although now it's almost like there's too much information. So if you want to find some weird thing to justify your thought, you can find it, hence the anti-vaxxers.
Right.
Because that's going to be the other question that comes out of this to me, is then what do the non-GMO people feel about a process like this?
Yeah, well, one thing to point out is that cell-based meat is not GMO, but it is, it is important to help people understand from the get-go exactly what it is, so that you don't see this sort of aversion to technology writ large just because. I think that is, we have seen we are seeing this desire in at least sort of a lot of the people that I spend a lot of time hanging out with. It's a very back to the roots, local food system kind of feel, and which is important and lovely, but also our food system is huge. And the vast majority of people don't necessarily have the opportunity to make those choices, and don't necessarily have the bandwidth to think about those choices. And the way that our food system has shifted towards sort of leveraging economies of scale is not something that's going to be undone in the next 12 years, right? So finding a way to create at scale meat that is much more environmentally friendly, and that helps us eschew some of the problems like rising antibiotic resistance, which is I mentioned the use of antibiotics earlier, but I think one thing that goes hand in hand with that is very important to underline is that when we use antibiotics at that scale, what we are doing is accelerating the development of antibiotic-resistant superbugs, which is one of the things that doesn't get as much play, right, as climate change, for instance, which we see all the time in the headlines. But a post-antibiotic world is something that would be an equal or greater threat to humanity, according to a study commissioned by the UK government, and could ultimately end up costing the global economy, I believe, $10 trillion.
Jeez.
I want to fact check that. But it's a phenomenal risk, and one that isn't getting talked about a lot. But it is completely inherent to the way that we're producing food right now.
Yeah, it's funny when you say climate change, because a lot of environmentalism in the average person's mind has been shifted to climate change, as though that's the one big thing that we still need to switch. But there's a lot of environmental issues that we need to work on that are overall going to affect the health of the planet, and this is one of them. It affects multiple parts of all of that, and then there's also the animal health issue, and maintaining the lives of these animals. Like, as I said, like on the farm that I grew up on, I think the animals had a great life, but I've also seen the mass scale chicken farms, which I can't watch those videos. It's tough. I love chicken. I eat lots of it. But I can't watch those videos. That's not where I want my food to come from. That's not where I want that type of stuff to come from. And I'm willing to try basically anything to get away from that type of treatment of animals. And if we can scale down that part of the industry so that the animals are having a better life, and scale up something like this so that especially when meat's becoming more and more expensive as well, if this can come in at a cost that's much lower, an environmental impact that's much lower, and a cleanliness that's better, I think that we're onto something that's really going to change the world. The question is, how far are we from being able to go to the grocery store and pick it up?
That is a great question, and it's one that I don't feel like I have the authority to give you a good answer on. What I will say is that this industry is progressing much faster than I think anyone had hoped or dreamed that it would. It's really only been 3 years since the first company incorporated, and we are just beyond sort of the 5-year anniversary of the first clean meat or cell-based meat burger, which Dr. Mark Post debuted. And he has since founded a company called Mosa Meat that is working in this space. So I think, you hear different things from different companies. I would bet that the first cell-based meat product that we see would be released sort of on a menu in a high-end restaurant somewhere. Yeah. And then from there, would sort of proliferate first among restaurant menus, and then perhaps ultimately in sort of the grocery store supply. But I think, there are still some critical questions in the technology that need to be addressed in order to be able to do this economically and in an environmentally responsible way at scale.
Yeah, because I think the question is how much energy it's taking to produce a pound of that cell-based meat, and how much better that is than what it currently costs to create a regular pound of beef, right? That's definitely one that's got to come along. But from what I understand, some of the stuff that I've read, that has decreased drastically in the last little while. And I mean, that's how an industry runs. And as you said, like when you're talking just 3 years in, when you consider what 3 years into cell phones or even 3 years into CDs was, right. It's going to move quickly, but to be this far in 3 years is very good for everything. So.
Yeah, I think it has sort of exceeded all expectations, or at least certainly mine in the past 3 years. So yeah, but there's definitely a need for continued and more research, which is one of the things that GFI is really invested in helping to accelerate. Our SciTech team actually just announced the winners to our inaugural competitive grant program. From the generosity of two donors, we were able to sort of solicit research proposals from all over the world for places in plant-based and cell-based meat technology where there are still big questions, and sort of distribute $3 million in scientific research funding to those scientists, which will go towards open access research that is available, sort of to the entire space. Because right now, when you have all these different companies doing this R&D, what's being discovered and the advances that are being made are protected by sort of their individual IP, which means that there is sort of an inherent repetition of a lot of the and more diverse creativity, certainly, but also repetitive effort in some places. So we're looking to minimize that.
Yeah, because there's a capitalist requirement in there to, somebody still wants to be first to the party, and to make the cash, but you also want to make sure that it's being done right and collectively the rising tide is raising all boats, as they might say.
Precisely.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time, Eric. A couple more questions for you just before we wrap this up. What's Plant Nasty?
What's Plant Nasty? So that's that is my sort of team of plant-based runners and athletes. We are a Strava community Strava's like social media for athletes. So yeah, over 1,000 strong on Strava, and I sort of found my way into the space and into thinking about the food system because I was starting to eat sort of a whole food plant-based diet, and I discovered that there's a rich community of fellow runners who also love eating plants. So that's what Plant Nasty is. We get together in Brooklyn and we go for runs, and then we hang out and drink coffee and eat plants.
Fair enough. So I usually do something to wrap up the podcast called Read, Watch, and Listen. It's just asking you something that people should read, something they should watch, and something they should listen to. So if I could, what do you think is something that everybody should read is? And it can literally be anything. It doesn't even have to be based on our topic.
Read. I would say Diet for a Small Planet, which is the Francis Moore Lepay book.
Okay.
And watch. I would say that everyone should put on their to-watch list, because it will be coming out, is a documentary chronicling sort of the development of Memphis meats and this nascent industry that is being produced by the documentary filmmaker, whose name has just flown out of my head, but it'll come to me in 30 seconds. Do you mind if I look that up really quickly? Because I want to say it properly. Oh, of course. Okay. It is called Meet the Future by Liz Marshall, and the trailer is available now, so you don't even have to wait to get a taste. I would say that everyone should listen to Bruce Friedrich, the executive director of GFI. His recent interview on the Rich Roll podcast, I think, does a really great job laying out GFI's theory of change and talking about our different areas of work.
All right. And if anybody wanted to get in contact with GFI or yourself, how would you like them to do so?
Folks should follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. And feel free to follow Plant Nasty on Twitter, though my content's not as interesting as Good Food Institute's. And I would say, for sure, sign up for our newsletter, which goes out twice a month, mostly written by yours truly.
Nice.
And yeah, just check out what we're doing and, hit the contact button on our website if you want to get in touch.
Perfect.
So that's my watch.
All right. Well, Mary, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you. This has been great. I'm always happy to chat.